There's something on the moon, and it doesn't want to be found. We never should have gone to space. Not after what I've seen at NASA. Yeah, that NASA. I used to work for them during the height of the space race. But I'm retired now. My bones are hurting and I wheeze more than I breathe. But before I punch my ticket out of here, I've got a story to tell. One that's been eating at me for decades. You see, we never really landed on the moon. We've always meant to, though. It was the summer of '69, and we were getting ready for the launch. The whole world was buzzing about Apollo 11. So that whole part's real. We had the rockets, the astronauts, and the math all worked out. Me? I was just a young buck back then. I was fresh out of college with a shiny new degree in engineering. And somehow I landed a gig as a junior engineer at NASA. And damn, was I living the dream. I was part of the team working on the communication systems. We had to make sure Armstrong and Aldrin could talk to us from all the way up on the moon's surface. Life at NASA was kind of like being in college again, actually. But this time, we had something bigger to worry about than a midterm test. A regular day started with grabbing a cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid. Then it was straight to checking last night's data, just to make sure nothing blew up or decided to stop working. My desk was always a mess. I had papers everywhere full of scribbles I made at 2 a.m. that I hoped would make sense in the morning. The place was always humming. Folks would be in and out of the offices, walking fast, talking faster, and we'd have these meetings that could go on for days. It felt like planning a really complicated road trip. Except the destination was the moon, and you couldn't just turn around if you forgot something. Lunch was usually at our desks, usually a sandwich in one hand and a pen in the other. Sometimes, we'd get so caught up in work we'd forget to eat until someone looked up and saw it was dark outside. But man, the thrill of it all. You'd be sitting there, tired as hell, and suddenly, something clicks, and you're one step closer to getting a man on the moon. With all the tech nowadays, that may not sound impressive to kids these days. But back then, it was as close to magic as you could get. That's what kept us going, even when the coffee ran out. But one night, a few weeks before the scheduled launch, we picked up something strange. I was testing the transponder we were supposed to use to talk to the guys up in space. My eyes were glued to my notes, but my head was dreaming about a cold beer. And that's when the signal came through. It wasn't like anything we'd ever heard before. It wasn't static. And it was too structured to be a glitch. It was a series of beeps and rings, like Morse code. And then we realized the signal was on a loop. That's not something you find in nature. We all huddled around, listening to this signal. The techs scrambled to find the source. Maybe some wires got crossed, or transmissions got mixed up. We looked all over to make sure it wasn't some sort of interference. Hell, maybe it was the Russians messing with us. Well, we did eventually find out the source. The signal was coming from outer space. We don't know how, but the data was right there before our eyes. Felt like the air dropped a few degrees when we found out. The room was silent, except for that beeping playing through the speakers. I remember looking over at my boss, a guy named Carl. He was a man who'd seen it all. He was there right when the space race was just kicking off, and he was white as a sheet. He stared at the speakers as if he'd just seen a ghost. "Shut it off," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, rumors, and more coffee. The excitement had turned into a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. We were no longer talking about trajectories and fuel calculations. No, all we talked about now was that signal. When we first caught that signal, it was like nothing we'd heard before. It wasn't just beeps and rings. This was a complex, tangled mess of sounds that got under your skin. The sounds overlapped one another. There were layers to it, almost like a song. We thought it was a message, maybe even a warning. We just couldn't figure it out. But we can't do the launch until we do. So that meant staying up all night with the team. Nights turned into a blur. Most of us camped out in the offices, hunched over the equipment, just endlessly replaying the signal to try and crack it. Our eyes were glued to printouts, ears filled with that eerie sound. Despite everything, we were excited at the thought of actually communicating with something out there. That was part of the thrill. But the excitement turned to frustration real quick. We tried everything, running the signal through every piece of analysis software we had, breaking it down, looking for patterns or repeats, anything that might give us a clue. But it was like trying to read a book with pages missing. So we called in the big guns, some code breakers from the NSA. These folks were the best of the best. They were used to dealing with the kind of secrets that could start or stop wars. If anyone could crack it, it was them. Or so we thought. They came in with their briefcases and serious faces. They set themselves up in an unused lab and got to work. Days passed, then weeks. We watched them, waiting for any progress. But it never came. The looks on their faces went from determined to puzzled to downright pissed. The long nights eventually took their toll. Tempers frayed, and those frantic meetings turned into shouting matches. What does it mean? And why can't we figure it out? But no one had the answers. And with each failed attempt, the pressure increased. We were supposed to be launching a mission to the moon. But instead, we were stuck. With an operation like this, we have no room for unknowns. We can't risk not knowing what this signal meant. With every passing day, the launch date loomed closer. I was practically living at the employee lounge now. Eventually, that signal started messing with us in ways we didn't expect. First, it was just headaches. The kind that feel like a band tightening around your skull. We could easily say that was from the late nights. But then, things got weirder. People began reporting nightmares. The kind that made someone wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Again, the medics could say it was from the stress. But these nightmares, they were the same for everyone. Those who had M reported seeing strange, towering structures on the moon. Twisted, pointy spires that were so tall they almost blocked out the stars. And there were things moving around between the towers. Huge lumbering shadows that rocked the ground with every step. And underneath it all was a humming sound. It blended with the beeping signal to form a song that made you sick. Then the paranoia kicked in next. You'd catch someone staring at the signal playback, their eyes glazed over, muttering to themselves. Simple conversations turned into arguments. People report hearing the signal even when they've gone home. So no one really questioned it when people started bringing sleeping bags to work. Hallucinations were the last straw. An engineer came running into the canteen one afternoon, white as a sheet. He kept yelling about seeing those towers from his dreams. He'd see them in the distance when he looked out of a window, and he'd feel the ground shake as those giant moon creatures moved closer and closer. The engineer had to be sedated after that. We tried to keep it all under wraps, to maintain a semblance of professionalism, you know? But the effects of that signal just kept getting worse. We tried to focus on other work, but the beeping had dug into our brains. It had spread among the departments. It was affecting people who weren't even involved in decoding it. One of the junior techs started talking about hearing a whispering sound. Came from the moon itself, he said. It was nonsense, of course, but when you looked into his eyes, you could see he believed every word of it. The whispers told him about secrets buried deep under the moon's surface, secrets meant for him to find. Then there was the astrophysicist who'd been with the project from the start. She claimed she could see the structures from her dreams on the images we have of the moon. She'd get people to look at her telescope and her printouts, insisting on it. We saw nothing, of course, but she was convinced. And then one of the math guys started freaking out. He went around saying he was turning into moon dust. He was staring at his hands one day when he suddenly screamed. He said his skin was cracking open. Little bits of him were turning to dust every time he moved. He was crumbling apart, he said. He could feel himself blowing away. It didn't make any sense to us, but the fear in his eyes was clear. He flinched if you even tried to touch him. Watching him, you could almost believe what he was saying was true. But it was the incident with Carl that made us all stop and realize just how bad things had gotten. Carl was a practical guy who never bought into any of the moon madness. Until one day, he started screaming in the middle of the control room. Screaming and pointing at an empty corner. He was saying he could see one of those moon entities right there, reaching out for him. In his panic, Carl backed away so fast he tripped over a cable. He went crashing into a bank of equipment and hit his head on a desk. He had to get stitches, and that was the wake-up call we all needed. This wasn't just stress or exhaustion. The signal was doing something to us, something real and physical. So, NASA went into full damage control mode. They started rounding up anyone who was talking too much about the signal or acting weird. They were to be given special attention in a quarantine zone. They sectioned off an unused wing on the campus to house them. But it wasn't long before more folks claimed they were turning into moon dust. The quarantine zone filled up quick. To keep the lid on all this, federal agents showed up. You could spot them a mile away with their stiff suits and stiffer faces. They walked around like they owned the place. They were there to make sure no one outside these walls got wind of what was happening. Suddenly, we had actors smiling at cameras for press conferences pretending to be NASA scientists, talking about how great the mission prep was going. And me? They slapped more work on my desk and told me not to leave. But then, I started noticing it too, moon dust. Or at least, my brain told me it was moon dust. I had no way to actually check. But I saw a fine chalky sand collecting in the corners of my office, on my papers, even on my keyboard. Every speck of it glimmered like it held a diamond. But I clamped down every instinct to tell someone about it. The last thing I wanted was to end up quarantined or worse. So I kept quiet. I pretended I didn't see the dust, and that I wasn't seeing them form into those towers from my dreams. I had to keep working, had to crack that signal. It was the only thing left that made any sort of sense. With everything going sideways, NASA was still hell-bent on keeping the show on the road. The group of us still poking at that signal had shrunk down to just a handful. The rest of the crew was all hands on deck for the launch. The astronauts were kept in the dark about the whole mess. They weren't allowed to really talk to any of us anymore. The higher-ups were worried they could get infected by this moon madness. But as the launch date grew closer, things got even weirder. We were gearing up for what should have been a routine systems check. It's something we'd done 100 times before. Only this time, nothing went right. Started small. Machines freezing, readings not making sense. We rebooted, double-checked the codes, and ran diagnostics. The usual drill. But then, the main control machines just lost its mind. Instead of the standard readouts, we got strange symbols nobody recognized. We tried to bypass the affected systems, but it was like the signal, or whatever the hell it was, had jumped from our heads into the machines. Commands were ignored, or worse, turned into gibberish. And then the telemetry data from the test module went haywire. 1 second it showed the module on the launch pad, stable as you please. The next, it was registering it as if it was already in lunar orbit. Impossible readings. The final straw came when the launch sequence itself initiated. All on its own. Alarms blared, lights flashed. We scrambled, hammering at keyboards and yanking cords. The sequence was stopped, thank the stars, but the damage was done. There was no way to explain it away. No amount of rebooting and recalibrating could scrub away the fact that our systems were compromised. We had to delay the launch. Officially, we blamed it on a technical glitch. But between us, we knew the truth. That signal wasn't just a sound in our ears or in our dreams anymore. It was here, actively messing with the launch. And those symbols, they weren't just random. They were trying to tell us something. The failure wasn't just a setback. It was a warning. And deep down, I think we all knew it. But admitting that meant facing the reality of what we were dealing with. And that was a step nobody at NASA was ready to take. Uncle Sam poured too much money and press into this to back out now. But despite the whole mess with the failed systems check, I felt like I hit the jackpot. Those symbols that popped up on the screens, I figured they might just be the key to cracking the signal. So, I grabbed the printouts and plastered them all over my office. Most nights, I went over those symbols over and over again. I tried to match them with anything, ancient languages, astronomical charts, you name it. But as the nights dragged on, my grip on what was real and what wasn't started to slip. More than once, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see my office coated in moon dust. It was getting to me, making me question what would crack first, the code or my sanity. And then one night I had the dream. Calling it vivid doesn't do it justice. It was more real than anything I'd ever experienced. I was standing on the dark side of the moon. But this wasn't the moon like any photo or textbook described it. The ground shimmered with a dull glow that cast eerie shadows all around me. The sky was filled with stars so dense and bright, it felt like I could reach out and stir them with my hand. But it wasn't peaceful or awe-inspiring. It was suffocating. There was a silence so heavy, it pressed against my ears. My head started to ache the more I tried to listen for something. Anything. It was a quiet so complete it screamed. And those structures, they towered over the landscape. They were made of materials that looked like a mix between metal and sand. The surfaces were so dark that it seemed to absorb the light. Their shapes were all wrong. The angles made my head hurt if I looked too long. It was as if they were designed to only be seen from the corner of your eye, not stared at directly. The most unsettling part? The moon dust. It wasn't just on the ground. It swirled around these structures, sticking to my hands and my face. I tried to wipe it away, but it clung to me, trying to make me part of the moon. In my dream, I kept walking. Each step kicked up clouds of that strange glittery dust. I walked until I came across a canyon. But this wasn't any ordinary canyon. It stretched far and wide, deeper than anything I'd ever seen. Its edges shimmered under the starlight. The sides were jagged, like giant teeth ready to snap shut. And it felt warm. A strange heat radiated from it, as if it led straight down to the core of the moon itself. Standing at its edge, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The darkness was calling to me, promising me answers if I only stepped forward. My feet moved on their own, leading me right to the edge. And that's when I heard it. A voice, echoing up from the canyon's depths. It wasn't loud, but it filled the silence around me. It resonated deep in my chest. "You do not belong here," it said, calm and impossibly sad. "Who are you?" I asked. "I am what you call the moon," the voice replied. "But I am not just rock and dust. I am alive, in a way you cannot understand." "Why are you telling me this?" I found myself asking, drawn to the voice. "Your kind seeks to walk upon my surface, to claim me as a conquest." The signal was a warning. "You are not welcome here, not because I wish to harm you, but because you are not ready." "Not ready for what?" The question slipped out before I could think. "For the truth that lies beyond your planet. There are things in this universe older and bigger than your minds can hold. You reach out with hands covered in blood and call it exploration." I felt defensive. I wanted to argue, but the voice continued. "I do not blame you, Jim Marshall. You are driven by curiosity, a trait I admire. But listen to my warning. Some doors are closed for a reason. Do not open them." "What are you protecting us from?" I needed to know. "From the darkness that even light cannot escape. From the past that should not be remembered. Your journey should be forward, not backward into the shadows. There are other beings on Earth that you must not take to the stars." The voice faded, leaving me standing at the canyon's edge. The warmth from the canyon felt comforting now, like a gentle reminder of the conversation I'd just had. The dream felt more real than any waking moment I'd ever experienced. And when I finally woke up, the memory of it clung to me. I sat in my office, the early sun across my desk. I knew now what must be done. The mission had to be stopped. The moon had spoken, and I couldn't ignore it. Waking up from that dream felt like climbing out of one reality into another. There, on my desk, was a report. It was in my own handwriting, but I couldn't remember when I'd made it. It was a translation of the signal, based on the symbols I've collected. The logic was laid out so clearly, I wondered how I could have missed it for so long. It was all there in plain text. The message from the moon telling us to stay away. I grabbed the report and made my way to the top brass at NASA. I had to tell them, show them what I'd found, what I'd written. Somehow, I just knew that there was a meeting that day. I knew which conference room they would be, and that no one would stop me from getting there. I burst into the room to find the project heads talking in hushed voices. "We can't go," I blurted out, holding up the report. "We have to cancel the mission." They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I tried to explain, to make them see reason. But before I could get far, the room filled with the sound of the signal. Phones, computers, every electronic device started blaring it out, louder and more piercing than ever. Dust, like the moon dust from my dream, started to gather in the corners of the room. And it wasn't just settling like regular dust. It swirled and thickened in corners as if it had a life of its own, as if it wanted to bury us in it. People clutched their ears in pain as the sound overwhelmed us. Everyone started to panic. They were holding their heads, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The sound was everywhere. It was inside us, grinding against our skulls. Then, as if the sound flipped a switch, people began to drop. It was like watching dominoes fall. One after the other. People would clutch their heads, cry out, and then just collapse. Some tried to brace themselves on tables or against walls. But down they went, slumping onto the floor in heaps. And then they'd start to bleed. It started as a small nosebleed here and there, but it got worse quickly. The blood would start gushing out of ears and noses. The contrast was shocking. That bright red against the harsh lights of the room. Panic turned into terror. The air was now thick with dust and filled with the iron scent of blood. It was chaos, pure and simple. And at the heart of it all was that ungodly noise, pushing us to the brink. "Please," I begged, my voice barely rising over the noise. "You have to listen to me. The moon, it's warning us. We can't go there." For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The officials stared at me. The report in my hand was now stained with drops of my own blood running from my nose. The realization of what was happening finally seemed to break through their skepticism. I see NASA's chief executive officer nod his head. As soon as he did, the room fell silent. The signal was gone. The decision that followed was made in silence. It was a mutual, unspoken agreement that the launch could not proceed. After that meeting, it was clear we couldn't go forward. NASA had to pull the plug, but they couldn't tell the world the real reason why. They said it was technical difficulties, which wasn't entirely a lie, considering everything was breaking down around us. Walking out of that room felt like stepping into a disaster movie. The control center, which was usually buzzing with activity, was silent except for the occasional groan or whimper. People were scattered all over the floor. Some of them were unconscious. Others were trying to stop the flow of blood from their noses with whatever they could find. It was a mess, a real bad one. I noticed the computers next. Screens were black, not even a flicker or cursor blinking back. I tried flipping a few switches, pressing some power buttons, but nothing. Dead as doornails, all of them. And the wires, Jesus, the wires. They had melted into the floor, even fusing with the tiles in places. You could see where some had sparked and left scorch marks. The communication equipment weren't any better. The radios, the satellite links, anything that could send a signal out or bring one in was fried. Handsets were hot to the touch and the films were melted through. And then there was the dust. It was like a thin blanket had settled over everything. It gave the whole place an eerie, abandoned look. Coated the desks, the equipment, even the chairs. Every step I took kicked up little clouds of it, floating in the air before settling back down. Everything that would have made the moon landing possible was either broken, bleeding, or buried under a layer of dust. Felt like we were cut off from the rest of the world, left to deal with the aftermath of something we still didn't fully understand. But now we all knew what had to be done next. The cover-up, man, it was something out of a sci-fi flick. They roped in everyone who knew anything about space and movie magic. We had these big sets that looked just like the moon's surface, all dusty and cratered. Scientists like me got pulled in to advise on how to make it look legit. They ran calculations on how the astronauts should move in low gravity. The astronauts were in on it too. They were forever sworn to secrecy. They were told to act out their parts, bouncing around on wires to fake that moon gravity. It was all filmed, then broadcasted as if it was happening live from the moon. They even planted a flag in the fake moon dust. And me? I was right there in the thick of it. I was suggesting tweaks to make it all look more convincing. Sometimes, I'd wake up from more of those dreams where I was walking on the moon. The voice from the canyon would whisper these little details. like how to get the shadows just right or make the flag flutter without wind. I couldn't tell if those dreams were the moon actually speaking to me or if I was losing my grip. But every suggestion from those dreams made the fake landing seem more real. And as the world was celebrating our one giant leap, I was in my office, dreaming about the moon. After everything that happened, I couldn't stay at NASA any longer. Faking the biggest achievement of human space exploration didn't sit right with me, even though we didn't really have a choice. I walked away, but I kept in touch with a few folks from the old team. They told me that some of the quarantine staff got better, like nothing ever happened. The lucky ones came out of it with total memory loss. They couldn't remember anything that happened in the weeks leading up to the launch. The official story was that there was a meningitis outbreak in the compound. NASA blamed it on some weird mold in the air vents. Over the years, I'd catch wind of new plans to communicate with what's out there or to finally get boots on the moon for real this time. But like clockwork, something would always go wrong. Equipment failure, communication breakdowns, you name it. I also know that other countries with space programs had their sights set on the moon too. And sure, some of them would say that they've sent people up there. But I know that it was all fake too. No one could make it work, and deep down I knew why. That signal wasn't just for us, it was for everyone. Humanity is not welcome beyond Earth.